Good morning, Sangha friends. It's my
Morning.
pleasure.
Morning.
It's my pleasure to welcome and introduce our guest, the Dharma teacher, David Loy. Welcome, David, to Buddha Eye Temple in our Sangha. I first encountered David's work maybe 10 or 15 years ago when I was searching to more fully understand engaged Buddhism. The search led me to the work and activism of Thich Nhat Hanh and to the work of Joanna Macy and her collaborations with the political economist David Korten. It also led me to the work of David. I appreciated David's work in comparative East-West philosophy, and I also appreciated the sophistication with which he explored political and economic theory in relationship to Buddhist practices. Perhaps most inspiring to me was David's commitment to explore the unfolding meaning of Buddhist practices for our modern world. Over the last 10 years, he's been engaged in exploring how Buddhist practice can help us not only live with, but meet the challenge of our ecological crisis. Today, we're pleased to have David here to share with us his study, practice, and wisdom. Welcome, David.
Thank you, Carl. And good morning, everyone. Can you hear and see me okay? Is that okay? Great. I'd like to begin with something that Noam Chomsky said last year in an interview. He said that we are now living in the most dangerous time ever in the history of humanity. That's a pretty extreme statement, needless to say. And being a bit of a history buff, I immediately sort of tried to think of some counter examples, but I couldn't. It seems to me he's right. And curiously, he doesn't even mention the COVID pandemic, which I think is wise in the sense that, horrific as that has been for so many people, so much suffering, nonetheless, it doesn't compare with, say, what happened in Europe and Central Asia in the 14th century, when up to a third of all the people died of the plague, right? He does talk about the climate crisis, but here I'm reminded of something I have to mention a lot. In fact, it's gotten to the point where I don't really talk about the climate crisis, urgent though it is, because it's really just the tip of a much larger ecological iceberg. The basic problem there is that there's this kind of consciousness that if we can just shift from fossil fuels to renewable sources of energy quickly enough, then our civilization can go on pretty much the way it has been. But when we factor in all the other things going on, the sixth great extinction event, degradation of farmland, agriculture, cutting down forests, so many toxins in the air, in the sea, in our drinking water, in the earth, in our bodies, and so forth. When you factor all this in and add other issues that Chomsky doesn't talk about, at least in this interview, when he talks about, social justice issues, when you factor all that in, it really seems to me that this is such a greatly important time in human history, because we now have this incredibly huge and powerful community of humanity that really seems to have lost its way. And I would even say that seems to be self-destructing. Obviously, there's a lot we could go into there to try to kind of unpack that. But given the limitations of time, of course, the issue for us is, what do Buddhist teachings and practices have to offer that can help us understand and respond to this situation? Here I'm reminded of a couple Zen stories. One of them, and I don't remember the actual protagonist, but in one of them, a student asked the master, "What should we do when difficult times come?" And the master says, it's kind of hard to show on Zoom, but he held out his arms and said, welcome. Our practice, our path isn't about avoiding difficult times. Zen Master Ryokan was asked, "Is there no way to avoid calamities?" And he replied, "When you're met with a calamity, meet it completely. That's how to avoid calamities. That's the wondrous dharma of avoiding calamities." And finally, a koan that some of us work on in the room, a student asked Zen Master Unmon, "What is the fruit of a lifetime of practice?" And Unmon replied, "An appropriate response," or as I prefer to say, because I think it's more colloquial, responding appropriately. Our path is that which enables us, teaches us to respond appropriately to whatever situation that we're in. An important reminder, right? Zen and indeed Buddhism generally, it's not about escaping or transcending this world. In a way, you could say it's the opposite. It's about being more fully in it in the sense of responding appropriately. But how do we do that in the kind of extraordinary situation that we find ourselves in? How does Buddhism help us do that when we remember, right? The Buddha, the historical Buddha, lived some 2,400 years ago in a very different time and place, Iron Age India. And indeed, all of the Asian Buddhist traditions are pre-modern. So I guess we shouldn't be surprised that we're not going to find specifics in those teachings about what we should do. But nonetheless, there are some really important implications in those teachings that we can extrapolate. One of them that I personally find the most fascinating is, I think, a very profound, precise parallel between what Buddhism has always had to say about our individual predicament and our collective predicament in relationship to the earth right now. By which I mean, as we know in Zen, let me say it a different way. If I had to pick out sort of one teaching of the Buddha that kind of summarizes it better than anything else, I would focus on the relationship between dukkha, right? That's the word we're usually translated as suffering, but we have to understand it in the broadest possible sense: dissatisfaction, anxiety, dis-ease, and so forth. The connection that Buddhism makes between dukkha and the delusion of a separate self. In modern terminology, we can say that the sense of separation that we have is a social and psychological construct, right? It's not sort of quote unquote natural in the sense that it's in the natural world. It's something that we learn. Babies, infants aren't born with it. It's part of the acculturation. It's part of growing up. And it really seems to me, though, if that's the fundamental problem, this delusion of separation, isn't that exactly the same problem we're facing now with relationship to the biosphere? Can't we say that the ecological crisis has its ultimate roots in the fact that we feel separate from the earth? And therefore, we feel that our well-being is separate from the well-being of the earth, that we can sort of use and exploit it in any way that we want to. And furthermore, that there's not only a karma built into that, in the sense that what we do to the earth tends to come back and affect us. If the earth gets sick, we get sick, and so forth. It's not simply that there's a karma there, but more fundamentally that there's a dukkha built into the fact that we feel that our fate, the meaning of our lives, both individually and collectively, becomes so problematic because we feel so disconnected from the earth and therefore have no sense of responsibility to what's happening to the earth. Again, if we had more time, it would be interesting to explore that further. But what I want to focus on this morning is what seems to me the single most important teaching that the Buddhist tradition has to offer that can help us understand and respond appropriately. And that is quite simply the Bodhisattva Path, or as I sometimes prefer to refer to it, the new Bodhisattva Path, or even if you want to say the Ecosattva Path. And what I'd like to do is emphasize three aspects of that. The first thing to say is that the Bodhisattva Path involves, and it always has, it involves a double-sided practice. It's like the two sides of a coin, right? Bodhisattvas continue to work on their own personal practice, right? Their own zazen, their own awakening, the development of serenity, the realization of emptiness, whatever you may want to say there. But there's also built into that the realization that that personal transformation is not enough, that we want to help others because there's built into that path the realization that they're not really other in the sense of being separate from ourselves. In other words, once we really deeply get into it, we realize that those two practices, personal transformation and working for alleviating and helping the larger transformation, that those two practices actually, it's not just that they go well together, there's a sense in which they need each other. Joanna Macy makes the point that in the early Buddhist scriptures, there's a simple and wonderful phrase describing the relationship between wisdom and action. They are like two hands washing each other. It's a dance of reciprocity. Here I'm reminded of one of my all-time favorite quotations by the Neo-Vedantin Nisargadatta, who summed up so much so well when he said, "When I look inside and see that I am nothing, that's wisdom. When I look outside and see that I am everything, that's love. Between these two, my life flows." That's beautiful, right? And it's really the two pillars of the Buddhist path, wisdom and love, or as we tend to say it, wisdom and compassion, right? Love here being not a feeling, but a different way of living in the world that embodies this realization of non-separation and therefore embodies the realization that, we don't just work for our own benefit, but for the well-being of everyone. I mean, when we start the Buddhist path, I think there's almost inevitably a certain kind of self-preoccupation, right? I mean, why do we start to follow the Zen path? I mean, when you think about all the time on our cushions, doing zazen and so forth, all the time, energy, money, effort, sore legs, sore back, etc., etc. Why would we do that? Well, it's because, to be frank, our lives aren't working as well as we would like them to be in some sense, or in more classical Buddhist terms, that there's some kind of dukkha that we feel that the practice can help us address, right? But the interesting thing is that if we remain preoccupied with our own mental condition and our own progress toward enlightenment, eventually that becomes something self-defeating, and that it actually ends up reinforcing this idea that my well-being, in this case my spiritual well-being, is separate, is distinct from yours and from the well-being of others, right? So you could say that insofar as the sense of a separate self is the basic problem, compassionate commitment to the well-being of others, of everyone, is an important part of the solution. Franz Kafka, the writer, said, quote, "You can hold yourself back from the sufferings of the world. That's something you're free to do. But perhaps your holding back is the one suffering you could avoid." You can hold yourself back from the sufferings of the world, but perhaps this very holding back is the one suffering you could avoid. Why? I think that many of us, certainly me, in my youth, when I started Zen practice, there's this kind of romanticized myth about, the meditator in a cave off by himself or herself, thinking of maybe like Milarepa in the Tibetan tradition, who's believed to have been someone who sort of went off by himself and actually attained Buddhahood in one lifetime. And we sort of have this idea that, once we're really deeply enlightened, then we return to society. And then then we do what we can to contribute. I think there's a misunderstanding built into that. As Joanna Macy also says, the world has a role to play in our awakening. Certainly, when I think back at the beginnings of my Zen practice, when I lived in the Maui Zendo, it was a pretty unconventional Zendo in a number of ways. It wasn't all that Japanese, but our practice was quite serious, and insights, kenshos, they happen. But it's interesting, and I'm sure this wasn't just for me, it was somehow easier in the meditation to have an insight and kind of opening, if you will, but actually integrating that into actually how I was as a person, overcoming my old bad habits in the sense of self-preoccupied or selfish habits. That was harder, actually integrating that. And that inevitably involved, going out and relating to other people and seeing what came up. Ram Dass once said, "So you think you're enlightened, huh? Well, go spend the holidays with your family." He talked about our practice as kind of a self-sharpening tool. So, through our Zazen, for example, through our Zen practice, something may happen. But when we go out and relate to other people, then we realize our limitations. We see where we still need to work on ourselves, right? So when you look at it from this perspective, engagement with the world's problems isn't a distraction from our personal spiritual practice, as it's all often been assumed, but it's an essential part of it. And you could say the one who benefits most from the Bodhisattva's activity is the Bodhisattva herself or himself. Kukai Kobodaishi, right, said, "The measure of our awakening is how we serve others." Bob Thurman used to say, "People are always talking about practice, practice, practice. What I want to know is, when is the performance?" Turns out that performance, how we actually act, how we actually live in the world, is an essential part of our practice. So that's the first point about the Bodhisattva path, the two hands washing each other, the interdependence of working on our own individual transformation and also being engaged in the world. The second point that I want to focus on, which is why I talk about the new Bodhisattva path or the Ecosattva path, is I think now we have a deeper and frankly a better understanding of dukkha and what the fundamental problem is, right? Dukkha, again, I expect you know, that's, as I said earlier, it's the word usually translated into English as suffering. And in fact, the Buddha said all he had to teach was dukkha and how to end it. The Four Noble Truths are all about dukkha, cause of dukkha, end of dukkha, how to end dukkha, and so forth. And it's interesting, when you go back to the original teachings, it's pretty clear from the Pali Canon that the Buddha was a lot more progressive than the institutions that developed after he died. I mean, when you look at the Bhikkhuni Sangha that he created for women, based on the realization that they had the same ability to wake up as men, right? Or his attitude toward caste, the fact that when you joined the Sangha, you lost all caste. You weren't even supposed to talk about it. I think that's really important. In the Aganya Sutra, he also very clearly talks about society as a kind of social construction. It's not like the Hindu idea that different castes refer to different parts of the body and you should accept that the Brahmins are superior and so forth. I think the Buddha was very insightful here, but what happened over time as Buddhism became assimilated, in order to survive and thrive, Buddhism came to some accommodation with the state, an accommodation that meant it really didn't challenge the state. Rather, the focus of the teachings and the understanding of dukkha was more and more solely on the individual level. So, for example, when you think about karma, right? The idea that somehow karma is working solely on the individual level. Um, if something bad happens to me, well, that's my karma because of something I did earlier in this lifetime or maybe in a past lifetime. And this has sometimes led to some pretty awful conclusions, I think. I once heard a Tibetan teacher say, sort of wonder out loud, oh, what terrible karma all of those Jews in Nazi Germany must have had to be born at that time in that place. And I thought, oh my goodness, this is unacceptable to blame the victim in that way. I think we need to understand, and I think we do have a better understanding of social forces. You might be a really nice person, but you can be in a time and a place where you get caught up in the most horrific historical, social things like that happening, right? To try to express this in terms of the three poisons or the three fires, right? The Buddha didn't talk in terms of good and evil, but he did talk about the three poisons: greed, ill will, delusion. And I think we can see how in the modern era they have become institutionalized. For example, I really think the kind of economic system we have, which focuses on consumerism and economic growth, and corporations are never profitable enough, or market share or stock prices never high enough, right? I think that institutionalizes greed in the sense of you always want more. We could also look in terms of ill will, militarism, racism, in terms of the way that has been built in. Anyway, in other places, I've sort of spent a lot of time trying to unpack that. But the fundamental point is the realization that although Buddhism, the way it's developed, has so much been focusing on the individual level, we need to see how the problems that Buddhism historically has been concerned about can also institutionalize in the sense of taking on a life of their own, right? It seems to me during my lifetime as an American Buddhist, I can see how it's much more accepted, indeed often encouraged, how, to be a Buddhist practitioner, we should be concerned in the sense of, say, helping other homeless people, or prison dharma or hospice work. That kind of thing is generally accepted. But important to have that as that is, I still think that there's sort of a component missing there. To use an analogy, I think we have become a lot better at pulling drowning people out of the river, feeling, a concern, a responsibility for doing that. But we're not all that much better in asking, why are there so many more people drowning in the river? Who or what is pushing them in upstream? And I think this is a challenge for us. I think it's something we need to think about. And it's going to be a big challenge because, that kind of conceptual thinking about what the problem is and what we need to do is not something that the tradition has really encouraged us. When Bill McKibben was in Paris for the climate talks a couple of years ago, a woman asked him, what can I really do as an individual? And he answered, stop being an individual, or stop thinking as an individual. I think that's important for Buddhism too. The three treasures, Buddha, Dharma, Sangha. Well, it seems to me in American Buddhism, we have a lot of teachers, we have a lot of teachings, but in many ways, I think what we're weakest on is Sangha, is community. And I think the challenge is that in order to work on these larger issues, I mean, it's easy enough for me to go to a kitchen and serve homeless people, but to really think about and try to address these larger issues, we have to work together. We have to become more of a community. That's not something we can really make much progress on an individual level, right? So that's the second point. This, I think, progressive, deeper understanding of what the fundamental problem is, what the dukkha. And I understand this as kind of a natural progression, the way Buddhism, by its own emphasis on impermanence and insubstantiality has sort of moved, how it can move in that direction, that Buddhism has within it built in, this ability to transform according to the historical situation, social situation, in order to be the most liberative, in order to be the most helpful. And that's where I think we need to go. I'd like to devote the rest of my time to the third point, which is that the Bodhisattva Path doesn't tell us what to do, but it has a great deal to offer about how to do what it is that we decide what to do. And again, this fits in with the fact that Buddhism, from its beginnings, and the other Asian Buddhist traditions are all pre-modern. I don't think that they can give us real specifics for the most part. And that a number of different things are possible. Classically, in the Bodhisattva Path, we are encouraged to develop 6 perfections, right? The paramitas, generosity, ethical behavior, endurance, persistence, mindfulness or some kind of contemplative practice, and finally prajna, wisdom, right? But of course, those are very general. How one actually applies those, that's the issue. It's interesting here, say in the Boulder community, we have a couple different eco-dharma groups, including the one that has created this eco-dharma center up in the mountains above Boulder. But different people are doing different things. One of my Zen friends, and actually he's a Zen teacher, is a retired banker. And, he has a special skill that I certainly don't have. He knows how to talk to conservatives, Republicans. So he goes to Congress and he lobbies for a carbon tax, right? And I'm sure he's very good at that. Other friends, when my wife and I moved to this house, they helped us. They were very good on the individual level, helping us reduce our carbon footprint. Some of us have been very involved in things like Extinction Rebellion, sort of seeing the importance of maybe civil disobedience or nonviolent direct action in drawing attention to what's going on and disrupting to some degree sort of business as usual. And we could ask, well, which of these is an appropriate Buddhist activity? And frankly, I think they all are. And I think many more as well, that we need to be creative here, which is something Buddhism encourages when you think about the idea of skillful means, upaya kasalya. Right? And when Buddhism talks about, how to say it, because for Buddhism, the fundamental issue isn't good versus evil, but it's delusion versus wisdom or ignorance versus awakening, right? That implies certain general parameters, right? Non-violence, and you could say political, social action motivated by love and compassion rather than anger or fear. And also within Buddhism, something else I really appreciate is the kind of pragmatism and the non-dogmatism, which we see exemplified so perfectly in that famous old story, maybe of my favorite Pali Canon story, where the Buddha, compared his Dharma to a raft, right? A raft that we use to help ferry ourselves across the river of life and death, right? Samsara. And when we get to the other side, we don't say, what a great raft, and we carry it around on our backs everywhere. No, we realize that, the raft has been helpful to achieve something, right? Buddhist teachings aren't sacred. We don't put them on an altar and worship them. Rather, they're a guidebook or they're a map that we use to do something, to go somewhere. But we don't privilege it in the sense of understanding it as sacred. The challenge isn't accepting or believing those teachings. The question is, what do we do with them? But none of that really gets at what for me is the most distinctive and powerful thing about spiritual activism, which is simply that bodhisattvas act without attachment to the results of their actions. Let me say that again. Bodhisattvas act without attachment to the results, right? Interesting that in the Pali Canon, the Buddha himself said that one characteristic of an awakened person is that their actions are nirasa, which is usually translated as something like without expectation or without hope, right? And interesting too that this isn't only found in Buddhism. If you think about the Bhagavad Gita, the teaching about karma yoga, the path of action, the path of engagement, you could say. And what's emphasized on that path is the idea of, again, non-attachment. As the Bhagavad Gita says, your right is to the work, not to the fruits. Nonetheless, acting without attachment, I think, important though it is, it's also very easily misunderstood. So I want to really conclude by talking about what I think it really refers to and why it can be so helpful to us today, right? Because if we misunderstand it, it can suggest a very casual attitude. It's like, what's important is my motivation, and it doesn't matter if anything actually is achieved. I think that's a really big misunderstanding, a misunderstanding that could be fatal in the sense that it really reduces our actual commitment to trying to do what is needed, right? So let me try to unpack this a little bit. First of all, by talking about the difference between something like a 100-meter dash and a marathon, right? Because when we run a 100-meter dash, the only thing that matters is getting to the other end as quickly as possible. But you can't run a marathon like that, right? I mean, you're going to burn yourself out really quickly. Instead, if you're running a marathon, you pace yourself. And an important part of that pacing is not fixating on the goal line. The important thing is to be moving in the right direction, which means you will eventually get there, but not so focused on the goal that is taking you away from the here and now. There's a Japanese term for this, right? Tada, just this, just this. In fact, in Sanskrit and Pali as well, in the early Buddhist teachings, tathata, just thisness. The Buddha sometimes described as the Tathagata, the one who just comes and just goes, right? You are approaching the goal because you are going in the right direction, but nonetheless, you're doing what's needed right here and now. The focus is on what's here and now. And of course, this is what our practice has always encouraged, right? When our minds wander, we come back to the now. Nonetheless, there's a lot more to say here too. Marathon's a long race, but what, 26 miles, something like that. But if you're moving in the right direction, you will eventually get there. Well, what about a race so long that in effect there's no end, right? What about a path with no end, with the task so difficult that we might become discouraged? Such as, what is the first of those 4 noble vows that we recited, right? Shujo Mohen Segando, right? Sentient beings, living beings are numberless. I vow to save, liberate, however you want to translate it, them all, right? If you really pause to think about it, that's pretty extraordinary commitment. We're vowing to do something that can't possibly be accomplished. How can we avoid feeling overwhelmed, right? The irony, of course, is that the vow cannot be fulfilled is not the problem, but it's actually the point. Since it can't be achieved, the point of the vow is really about reorienting the meaning of one's life away from the usual, what's in it for me, to what can I do to make this a better world for everyone, right? So on a day-to-day level, what becomes important is not the unattainable goal, but the direction of our efforts, which orients us without providing any particular end point, right? Now, why do I talk about this with reference to the eco-crisis? Well, someone who has volunteered for a job that's literally hopeless, in the sense it can't be completed, is not going to be intimidated by challenges that can sometimes appear hopeless, right? So what we're really talking about with the Bodhisattva vows is a new way of being in the world, a fundamental reorientation. No matter what happens, we don't get discouraged, or if we do, it's not for long, because after all, we have our practice, right? We can return to our mindful breathing and so forth. But eventually, we dust ourselves off and we get on with it. because the vow goes beyond attachment to any particular result, you see. When our efforts are successful, fine, great. Then we move on to the next thing. If they're not successful, well, we keep trying, or maybe we keep trying in a different way, indefinitely. And the point is, ultimately, that's not a burden. It's not a never-ending hassle. Once we get some insight into our non-duality with other people and with this magnificent planet that takes care of us all, this is the way we want to live. We don't want to do anything else. It becomes our passion. It becomes our joy. But there's a third and a final point that stands out most for me. To be quite frank, and I've spent a lot of time over the last few years studying the ecological crisis, it looks difficult. It's tough. And there's the very real possibility that our efforts are going to be in vain, right? Privately and even sometimes publicly, you have climate scientists who are saying, who are becoming pessimistic. We are close to tipping points, or maybe we've passed tipping points after which, it doesn't look good. It's difficult to anticipate what's going to happen, but let's just say it's not encouraging. Not only maybe for the modern civilization, but you also have some people saying that things can happen if the earth becomes too hot. Even the question of the survival of our species might be at stake. But the big issue there is we don't know. We just don't know. Just don't know. Have you ever heard that before? Does that sound familiar? Isn't something that our practice encourages, don't know mind? What's that koan? Not knowing is most intimate. Not knowing, the first tenet of the Zen peacemakers. The other two being bearing witness to the joy and sorrow of the world. The third meaning taking actions that arise from that not knowing. Roshi Egyoku Nikao describes not knowing as a flash of openness or a sudden shift to being present in the moment, in which we take shelter in, and I think I'd prefer to say that, in which we open up to the place before anything arises, a place of emptiness and profound silence. We become more spacious, more aware of our own reactivity, more open to others. We're less defensive, less fixated on our own understanding. In fact, not knowing is not really a fixed position, but a way of engaging with the world right as it is, just as it is right now. We don't know what's going to happen next, but we do our best to respond appropriately, according to what we understand, and we're ready to change as the situation changes or as our understanding of the situation changes. I'm reminded here of a poem by Wendell Berry, The Real Work. It may be that when we no longer know what to do, we've come to our real work. And that when we no longer know which way to go, we've come to our real journey. The mind that is not baffled is not employed. The impeded stream is the one that sings. One of my teachers, Robert Aitken in Hawaii, Aitken Roshi, liked to say that our task, our spiritual task, is not to clear up the mystery, but to make the mystery clear. This is the other side of don't know mind. Our spiritual path isn't about, now I understand everything. No, it's really opening up to mysterious, profoundly mysterious world where everything is changing, whether we notice it or not. And we access this mystery not by sort of grasping it in order to rest in it serenely, but in being taken by it, opening up and being taken by it, so that we are manifesting something greater than our egos. So this awesome mystery is not debilitating, but empowering, because it frees us from dogmatism and our fixed ideas about ourselves and the world and what's possible. So we do the best we can in response to the best we know, even if we don't know for sure. Let me emphasize here that I'm not talking about optimism or being hopeful. It seems to me both of those are caught up in the kinds of dualities, right? Optimism, pessimism. Reminds me of my favorite definition of a pessimist, someone who has had to live with an optimist. Um, Getting caught up in these dualities, bouncing back and forth between them. There's a really important distinction between despair and grief. Grief is here and now. And it's really important, I think, for us to feel that, because so often we're repressing our grief about what's happening. It's important to feel that, but then projecting it into the future, then we get caught up in these dualities, especially the duality of hope and despair, right? The point being that bodhisattvas are motivated by something deeper than that duality, deeper than hope in the usual sense. It's more a kind of compassionate generosity of spirit that wants to express itself, and although it seeks results, does not require them. Here too, Joanna Macy has something very important to say about hope. Quote, I find that assuring people there's hope, including myself, is not all that useful. In Buddhism, there's no word for hope. It takes you out of the present moment and into conjecture. It would be a distraction from what's at hand. I think all we can really affirm is where we want to put our attention. We have a choice. Do we want to give up and surrender to the great unraveling, or do we want to join those working for a livable future? Since the outcome is uncertain, we have to enjoy doing something exhilarating and useful without knowing for sure, again, not knowing mind, without knowing for sure if it's going to work out. I like what Wendell Berry said also about this. Quote, we don't have the right to ask whether we're going to succeed or not. The only question we have the right to ask is, what's the right thing to do? What does this earth require of us if we want to continue to live on it? And I think this points to the deepest meaning of non-attachment to results and don't know mind in this time of world crisis. And for me, this is what sums it all up, right? Our task is to do the very best we can, not knowing if anything we do will make any difference whatsoever, not knowing what the consequences will be. Let me say that again, because I think that's maybe the most important thing of all. Our task, our job, what we are called upon to do as bodhisattvas is the very best we can, not knowing what the results will be, if any. Have we already passed ecological tipping points and civilization as we know it is doomed? We don't know, but that's okay. Of course, there's hope in the sense of our concern that our efforts will bear fruit, right? We try to be as strategic as possible. It's not just symbolic stuff. But ultimately, what we need to remember is that when we're engaged in ecological activism, what we do is our gift to the earth, gratis. You don't give a gift with the expectation of something in return, then it's not really a gift. We don't know, we can't know if what we do is important, but it's important for us to do it. To act without attachment to results is very difficult, maybe impossible in one way, unless we have some kind of spiritual foundation. And that's why I think it comes back to this other side of the Bodhisattva path, that we continue to work on our own personal transformation. To be so unattached to the results of our efforts, that's to set the bar very high. Maybe none of us can do that, but the point is, because we have that kind of practice, when we feel frustrated, we know what to do, right? In conclusion, I wonder if the earth today is calling upon all of us to be bodhisattvas, ecosattvas. And frankly, it seems to me that if we don't want to do this, if Buddhists cannot or do not want to follow this Bodhisattva path, then maybe Buddhism, maybe Zen Buddhism would not be what the world needs today. But what I've tried to do in this talk is to sort of unpack just how much I think Buddhist perspective can actually help us understand and respond appropriately to what Chomsky says rightly is the greatest challenge that humanity has ever faced. And I think it's really important for us as students on the way to find ways to come together and to work together in response to that challenge. I'll leave it at that with apologies for talking too long. Thank you.
Thank you, David. I think maybe we have time for a couple of questions here. Do we have any questions in the hall?
I've got a question about your kind of journey into studying our climate crisis. And did you ever experience a time where it felt like there was no justifiable path forward? And if so, how did you arrive at your current feeling of like, oh, there's things to do, we do them, maybe they'll work, maybe they don't, but I'm enjoying it, or I find it satisfactory in some way to progress?
Well, I think that's a good question, and that's not something that I have, it's not like I've passed through that. And I mean, there are still moments, once you really look and spend a lot of effort sort of reading what's going on, the situation is pretty grim. And that's without adding all of the other issues about, nationalisms and possibility of nuclear war and authoritarianism and social justice issues. So yes, there are moments when I wonder, and there's that temptation. But it's interesting. I think because of the groundedness in the meditation, it constantly brings me back to this sense that I'm rooted, I'm grounded in something greater than myself that wants to manifest through me. So there might be those moments, but okay, even if things are falling apart, and the whole point of don't know mind is we can't know for sure, and we can't. Even if things are falling apart, what do I want to be doing with my life? What? Okay, I mean, I like ice cream. So should I spend my time eating ice cream or traveling around the world it's like, what do I really feel? And it's deeper than ego. It's something that wants to keep doing what it can. And there's something very, very joyful in that on the moment to moment basis without attachment to the actual results. Yeah. I guess that's a long way of saying I still have those moments. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, David. Do we have a question from any of our Zoomers?
I have a question. I am very happy, David. Thank you for speaking. I was in the group that read the book, and I think it's such a great book, and really encourage everyone to read it. It's really well organized and opens up and reinforces many of the things you talked about today. I'm just wondering, the book was published in 2018, and since then, a lot of people have read it. You've had a lot of conversations. I'm just wondering if there's anything since the publication of it and the feedback that you've gotten, if you'd add to what you presented, or have further thoughts on the Buddhists who are digesting it, I guess I'd say.
Was it really published that long ago? Wow.
Well, it says that. That it was the public date. Yeah.
Yeah. Good question. And maybe we'll talk more about that on Tuesday night. The book group. Yeah, I think what's happened is there's an aspect of that that I've sort of where I've gone. So I'm in the process of writing a book now on sort of a Buddhist perspective on evolutionary psychology, or sort of looking at trying to understand the roots of the problems. Where do they come from? You know, um, and so it's not as though I would change much about the book, except maybe update the very beginning where it talks about our specific situation, but rather sort of trying to sort of supplement it by adding something different there. So yeah, I'm trying to think now, is there anything that I would want to change? There are a few things where maybe something that are very difficult to articulate, especially in chapter 5. I'm not totally satisfied by any means, but otherwise I don't know that there would be a major. I'll think about it. Maybe we can talk more Tuesday night. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Maybe one more question from the hall or the Zoomers.
I have a question. I was also part of the group that read the book. And thank you so much for your talk today. I have a lot to digest here. I am a mother of young children, and my friends have older children. And I was particularly taken with your metaphor of we've become good at pulling people out of the river, but not so much at addressing what's pushing them into the river upstream. And I'm really concerned about our young people's view of the ecological crisis. And it's become a mental health and spiritual crisis for them. And there's an epidemic of suicide in our young people. So my question is that there is urgency to address what's going on in a tangible way. And what can we do, or what have you seen going on for young people to not push them into the river of despair, and give them, and I hesitate to use the word hope here, but give them the teachings in an urgent way?
I'll say what I can, which is not very much. I think, in a way, I'm not sure how to say this. In a way, I think there's an advantage for the young people, and I don't mean to speak lightly of the real challenge for them, but in a sense that the kind of consumerist lifestyle that many of us sort of grew up in a world that just kind of took that for granted. Consumerism, individualism, what's in it for me? I'm going to go to college. I'm going to get a really good job. I'm going to make nice money. I'm going to have a very comfortable life. That's all questionable, if not blown to hell. And I think what's really powerful, what may be a really important thing for young people, is cutting through the delusion of separation and individualism, and how much they can find other people who share their concerns. That, in other words, what I guess what I'm trying to say is there is a bit of a silver lining to the cloud that you describe and without denying the cloud, I think there are also possibilities. It seems to me the American way of life as it has been understood, consumerism, etc., is a kind of religion of the modern, that's the real religion of the modern age, and it's a false religion, and it's a horrible religion in many ways. And the advantage of the kind of horrible situation that we find ourselves in, it's that it's cutting through, it tends to cut through all that delusion, and it forces them to ask these deeper questions. And I think the issue is, do they find other people that they can connect with, that they can work with, that they can form a community with? If they feel individualized, it's really going to kind of burn them up. And that's when they will be more likely to do something awful to themselves. But if there's some way for them to feel that the urgency of this situation can bring them together, then I think there's something that can very wonderful come out of it. And therefore, I'm wondering, for those of us who are older, can we play a role in that? You know, what can we do to help our young people in that regard? I don't know. That's all I can say. And, you know, I'm not a child psychologist, and I'm sure a psychologist could say a lot more. Obviously, at different ages, you know, there's things you can tell them. There are things that there are different ways to tell people about different things. At a certain point, the urgency of our situation is something that, you know, has to be communicated. And as I'm saying, I think a lot of it has to do with whether they feel personally, individually confronted by it, or whether it's something that actually they can learn to cope with together.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, Carl.
And thank you very much for your talk. And we'll look forward to many more conversations. And obviously, the work that's in front of us, we all need to think about how our practice can help us shift our perception to kind of do what we need to do and what the planet needs us to do. So we'll go ahead now and we'll conclude our service.